everybody. Welcome to Medical Myths, a show about what not to do with your body. And today, I was going to talk about peptides, especially in the wellness industry, because that is also a big issue going on right now. And of course, also related to RFK Jr. and his takeover of the health infrastructure of the United States. But something more urgent came up, and so we are changing gears once again to talk about the CDC. I'm sure all of you have seen the news this past week about how they have changed their website to now say that vaccines might cause autism, or that we'll see exactly what their stance is on this. That is the focus of today's show. And once again, for people who are new here, there are two streams going on today. There is the vertical and the horizontal stream. So take your pick, whichever one you would like to get in on. Additionally, today we have two left of these immunity wellness shots. If you want me to do one of these, you have to send a super chat of $3 or more, and I will get to that at some point during the show. We have a question from the side chat. Honest question. Autism's False Prophets was published in 2008. Andrew Wakefield's almost single-handedly started this insanity. Is there ever a point we can escape this science denial as a country? I honestly don't think we're going to be able to escape it at this point. The propaganda runs very deep, and the best we can do is try to educate people. But again, we have this other issue now too, where the educational system in this country is also being dismantled. So this is definitely working hand in hand to create a really terrible circumstance. And Miranda asks, where do we get information if we can't trust the CDC? And that's definitely one of the big reasons why we're talking about this today, because many of the top professional boards have now made statements saying that the CDC is no longer trustworthy, and that is what we are seeing today. So my recommendations would be, of course, to not get the information from the CDC, but look to more global institutions. The WHO is still a place you can go. Of course, that's going to be, again, global. Other organizations within the United States that you can go to are through the AAP, which is the American Academy of Pediatrics, ACOG for reproductive and OB related issues. The AMA is usually pretty decent. The AOA, I would tend to stick towards these medical entities in themselves in order to get this information, because you are correct. The CDC is no longer trustworthy. And we have our first super chat from Quantos Nachos. Thank you so much. Let's get this party started right, Doc. Also, this is a weird lump on my back, a mole, cancer, or a gummy bear. I can't tell you that information, but I can do this immunity shot here before we get into this. So, huzzah, everyone. This is, again, one of the ginger and turmeric ones. So, and another response from Quantos Nachos. This is a gummy bear. Congrats on your gummy bear. Well, let's get into this nonsense today. Here we go. So we're going to first look at the CDC's updates to their website, and then we are also going to read some rebuttals from the AAP, also just some general rebuttals about the whole concept of autism being related to vaccines. There are some sources cited by the CDC in this article. However, some of them are not easy to access or hidden behind a paywall, so we cannot access all of them, and there are only like 4 sources listed. So that is going to be an absolute blast. But I was looking at the AAP real quick. Here's the CDC page. Autism and vaccines from November 19th, 2025. So just a few days ago. their key points. They are stating that the claim vaccines do not cause autism is not an evidence-based claim because studies have not ruled out the possibility that infant vaccines cause autism. So we're already in a bad situation here with this statement. They are wanting the medical community to falsify the assertion that vaccines cause autism, which is logically not a very, good idea, right? Um, I realize I'm hidden behind my little thing on the vertical one. I'm going to remove that real quick. We are I'm working on these assets. Oh, here we go. This is why. This is why I had it set to the wrong scene. Um, okay, so this makes it look better. Okay, so but the issue here, right? We see this with creationist claims. We see this as a pretty common logical blunder. Is the idea that the person like accepting the null hypothesis is the one that has to prove that the null hypothesis is true. So what I mean by that, if we have a study, right? So the current consensus or the current knowledge is referred to as the null hypothesis. That is what we already accept to be true. Or in a case where we don't really know what's going on at all, the null could be just there is no significant difference between the nothing population and whatever intervention you're going to be looking at. So the null is what we already accept, right? And so when we're doing a study, the goal is to find out if we can reject the null, if we can reject the current consensus. And so there's a pretty high burden of proof that that the data has to meet, that the argument has to meet in order to reject the null. And so this is where we get pretty heavily into statistics. You have to evaluate the numbers and say, is this a coincidence? Or is this significant? And does this mean that our current body of knowledge is incorrect in some way? So if the null cannot be rejected, if we don't have enough evidence to overturn the current body of knowledge, then we do not, I have to phrase this correctly. We do not reject. So it's either to reject the null or to not reject the null. It's not necessarily saying that there is no that there's no basis for that claim. It just means we don't have any evidence to back that up. But the point here with that is you have to take the position of the null first. You can't say, well, we can't prove that we can't prove. I'm trying to word this in a way that actually is coherent because this is just not a coherent statement. No, but compare this to Russell's teapot, right? So we have this analogy where if there's a teapot floating around in space, it's not my job to prove that that teapot isn't there, right? The burden is on the person suggesting or making the claim that the teapot is there to provide evidence that there is a teapot floating in space. So that's the same thing here. The burden is not on those saying, burden is not on us to disprove that vaccines cause autism because it is very, very difficult to prove a negative statement. However, the burden is on the CDC here. It is on the researchers to prove that there is a significant difference, that the data is significant to suggest a causal relationship. And thus far, we do not have any sufficient data to suggest a causal relationship. Everything that we've seen so far has been correlation and not causation. Oh, thank you, Launcher. Yeah, I changed the stream the one that I was supposed to be doing today, I moved because this new issue is much more pressing. So last night I went in and changed the whole stream because um, we needed to talk about this. So that's key point number one is already BS, and I feel like I can make this font even bigger for y'all. Okay. Um, their second key point: studies supporting a link have been ignored by health authorities, which is not true. These studies, and we'll look at some of these. The studies supporting a link have failed to prove their case. They have failed to prove a causal relationship. So, sure, they may have demonstrated a correlation, but that does not imply a causation. And their key point number three is that the HHS has launched a comprehensive assessment of the causes of autism, including investigations on plausible biologic mechanisms and potential causal links. So, this here has me concerned for extreme bias in the way that their study protocols are going to be formulated, right? Because the goal is to go into this as unbiased as possible and say, let's create a situation where we can standardize all possible variables and evaluate what happens. Right? There's a problem when we're going in with the conclusion that something is already true. And so in RFK Jr.'s more recent statement that we're doing the studies to make the proof, that's not how any of this works. And that is going to predispose you to high levels of bias and high levels of error. Right. So like an example here. So I have a whole separate video on two types of error. So there's type 1 error, type 2 error, and all that. So um, it's important that you don't go in thinking that something's already the conclusion, right? So if you have somebody, let's say this one is actually pretty common. You have somebody who is assigned female at birth, right? And they have abdominal pain. If you decide before going in the room that this person is pregnant, right? You're probably not going to take care of that person as well as you could, because what if that person is has had a hysterectomy? What if that person is not able to have children? What if that person is not sexually active and therefore not going to be pregnant? So you've missed out on your opportunity to actually get to the bottom of the problem, and uh, instead gave yourself a bias, and now you're going to evaluate, and now your thoughts are, this patient is lying to me, because you already thought that they were going to be pregnant. So we can't do that. We need to go in as a blank slate, or as blank slate as possible, gather the information, and then evaluate the subjective and the objective data together and come up with, do we have enough evidence to reach a conclusion? And so this framework is inherently problematic. So that's something else too. If we're looking at this, and if we are looking at medical science and a source that is supposed to be communicating up-to-date medical science, having this framework of inherent bias is extremely problematic. And so even in looking at other statements, let's say if the CDC wants to talk about pollution, or if they want to talk about nutrition or something else, they've already set themselves up to not be a trustworthy source of information. So this next paragraph from them: vaccines do not. So they say vaccines do not cause autism. Asterisk. Pursuant to the Data Quality Act, which requires federal agencies to ensure the quality, objectivity, utility, and integrity of information they disseminate to the public, this webpage has been updated because the statement "vaccines do not cause autism" is not an evidence-based claim. Scientific studies have not ruled out the possibility that infant vaccines contribute to the development of autism. However, this statement has historically been disseminated by the CDC and other federal health agencies within HHS to prevent vaccine hesitancy. And again, this is problematic reasoning, because as I got into in the key points. HHS had launched a comprehensive assessment of the causes of autism, including investigations on plausible biologic mechanisms and potential causal links. So, yeah, they're doing the studies to make the proof. This webpage will be updated with gold standard science, which, okay, so this is what we saw in last week's show and keep seeing again and again, using phrases that are supposed to mean something specific. Like gold standard science has a set definition. The gold standard means that there is sufficient, like that the data has been collected in a manner that is going to be standardized up to the highest level of standards. It is going to be verified and vetted by experts who work in these fields and who have expertise in these. And the fact, too, may I mention that within a lot of these new studies, there are not very many physicians actually conducting this research. So you're trying to make claims, you're trying to make medical claims and drive the standards of care and drive the medical guidelines, yet you are not relying on the medical professionals who actually do this on a day-to-day basis, which is really scary and just a poor way to conduct scientific research. Um, and again, going in with the bias of trying to demonstrate what you already believe to be true. The following, as required by the DQA, details the state of the evidence and studies and the lack thereof regarding vaccines and autism spectrum disorder, and outlines HHS future research directions to provide answers. Yeah, so this is where it gets kind of funny because they're trying to pass themselves off as credible, and to the untrained eye, this may, if you already trust the CDC, you could maybe be persuaded by their anecdotal evidence here, which I say anecdotal evidence, it's not evidence, they're anecdotes. It's critical to assess questions the American people have about the cause of autism to ensure public health guidance is adequately responsive to their concerns. It's critical to address questions, yes. However, we've been addressing these questions for decades, right? The questions we need to be addressing are uh, debunking the myths about autism and vaccines, debunking the concerns that people have been, conditioned to believe with this propaganda. Their next statement here: approximately 1 in 2 surveyed parents of autistic children believe vaccines played a role in their child's autism, often pointing to vaccines their child received in the first 6 months of life, specifically the DTaP, Hep B, HIB, polio virus, and the pneumonia vaccine, and the MMR. Which, yes, parents have questions. The reason parents have all these questions is because of the pseudoscience that has plagued the media over the past several decades, right? That is the reason. And if Wakefield didn't come out and publish his extremely problematic study, we probably would not be in this mess today. And dare I say, the fact that parents have questions is not a reason to say that autism is caused by vaccines. Just because people have concerns does not mean that those concerns are legitimate, right? Um, and and I want to point out that looking into a specific cause for neurodivergence is really scary in that it is likely going to be utilized, like if they find a set cause, which there isn't one set cause. I mean, probably the most important component is genetics, right? And even if there is a two-hit hypothesis or a multi-hit hypothesis, the primary driver is going to be genetics. And the problem here is this going to lead to eugenics? Are people going to try to DNA test their babies or in other way test for autism early on and terminate their pregnancies because of having an autistic child, or they're going to try to genetically engineer autism out of the population. And that is a very, very scary thing. And that's also what we're seeing with people trying to find the cause of gender dysphoria and the cause of trans identity. So this is a really, really scary thing. Um, and with that, so explaining a bit more about what the two hit or what the multi hit hypothesis is. So there's a concept, especially within oncology, where you need multiple things to fail in order to get cancer, right? And if you already have genetic predisposition for cancer, that's one hit. You have one mutation that's already going to predispose you to cancer. Now you get a second hit on another mutation or another gene that is significant enough to work together with the previous mutation to cause malignancy. So if you have a single hit being a genetic component, and then you add on an environmental component, and those two work together, some people are saying that that could be um, contributing to autism in society. And whether or not this is a multi-hit hypothesis, I don't know. It's also pretty irrelevant because either way, there are going to be autistic people out there. And the right answer is not to eradicate people with autism. The answer is to improve diagnostic criteria, improve support, improve access to medical care. And that is what the correct answer is. And also affirmation, acceptance, changing societal perception of autistic people. Right, that is what is going to do the least amount of harm and the greatest benefit. In 1986, the CDC's childhood immunization schedule for infants less than or equal to 1 year of age recommended 5 total doses of vaccines, 2 oral doses of oral polio vaccine, 3 injected doses of diphtheria, the DTaP, um, and 3 doses of rotavirus, 3 doses of Hep B, DTaP, Hib, PCV, and IPV by 6 months of age, 2 doses of influenza vaccine, uh, and so they're using a fear tactic to say, look at all these vaccines kids are getting, and then they say the rise in autism prevalence since the 1980s correlates with the rise in the number of vaccines given to infants. Again, this is a correlation, not a causation argument, right? And so if we look into this as well, let's break down this argument. So if someone says vaccines cause autism, okay, what about the vaccine is the issue? Is it just the fact that you're getting an injection with stuff in it? Does that cause autism? If so, does insulin cause autism? Does testosterone injection cause autism? Like, okay, so it's not the fact that you're getting an injection. Is it the fact that you're injecting a virus? Okay, well, is it going to be a difference in risk for autism if you have an inactivated virus versus uh like a killed virus? There, I would expect to see a difference in that if you're using completely different viruses, completely different components. If you're using, like for COVID, if you're using a spike protein to drive your vaccine efficacy, is it the proteins? What component are you saying is the contributor to autism? Because it's not consistent, right? Like this is similar to trying to find a cure for cancer. It's not going to be a singular cure for cancer because every cancer has a different mechanism and a different pathophysiology of how it uh, becomes malignant and how it continues to propagate. So it's a similar thing here. Measles is not Hep B. They do not work in the same way. Same thing with flu virus and COVID. Like the reason why you can't use these vaccines interchangeably is because they're completely different mechanisms. So it's not the fact that you're getting a virus injected into you. Um, the most common argument people will give is that it's the thimerosal, which thimerosal is not commonly used anymore, at least not in the most common vaccines that people get. And it's in such a small dose that, like, my concern. So, in a lot of the studies that we saw with trying to point out mercury as the cause of autism, thimerosal is not elemental mercury. It is not methyl mercury. It is ethyl mercury, which is safe in very, very small doses that you're getting within the vaccines. And again, not that much anymore because because of the concerns, we've stopped using that. Methyl mercury, and in fact, methyl groups are related to toxicity in multiple different compounds. So let's think of an example between ethanol and methanol, right? Ethanol is the alcohol that you drink in beer, in hard liquor, and that is pretty safe up to a certain point. You can ingest it, and you can do so safely. Yes, there are problems with ethanol, but methanol is toxic at a much, much lower dose. So methanol is often fatal. It's often fatal in the amount. Like, if you were to accidentally drink methanol in the same amount, like if you had two beer bottles, one of them was even, let's say one of them was straight ethanol and the other was straight methanol, you would die much, much sooner from the one that is straight methanol than from ethanol. So people not taking that into account. And then also, it's not elemental mercury. There are videos that I've seen people show where they put elemental mercury on neurons and watch the neurons get injured. But let me put this back on them. Sodium, elemental sodium. If you ate elemental sodium, you would explode. Same thing with chloride, elemental chlorine. Uh, Chlorine gas is toxic and could very likely kill you in small doses. So we cannot make that comparison to say that, well, mercury causes neuron damage in vitro, therefore thimerosal in vaccines is causing autism. You can't make that jump. And another point there, if we're no longer using thimerosal in the majority of vaccines, then how are those vaccines still causing autism? Right? So you have to there's a burden on these people not only to support a causal relationship between vaccines and autism, they need to state which specific vaccines are doing this, by what mechanism, what is the component or multiple components in the vaccines that are causing it, and in what dosage do they do that? Right? They have a high burden of proof. They have a lot to explain, and they are not doing that. All they are doing in this rhetoric is stating that people have had concerns, kids get a lot of vaccines, autism rates are increasing. And they think that that is a sufficient argument to state that vaccines cause autism. Right? This is a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. So in the same vein, I can claim that, what's something stupid that I can claim? I can claim that I don't know, I'm trying to think of something really stupid. Somebody in the audience could probably figure one out. If I claim that this monster can, here, we'll do that. If I claim that this monster can make me fly, and then I get on an airplane and fly somewhere. It's like, well, I drank a monster and then I literally flew in the sky. Right? We know that that's not true. I left out a key piece of information that I was flying on an airplane, and not that I did not mean that I was actually flying like by myself because I drank monster. But I couldn't make that claim, and that would have the same logical validity that this statement does. So this is an extremely poor argument. Um, Getting more into this, though, the cause of autism is likely to be multifactorial. So they're shrugging that off as an unimportant component. The scientific foundation to rule out one potential contributor entirely has not been established, which here's again another logical problem here. That we haven't ruled out potential contributors entirely, which science does not do that. You can't prove 100% that you can't really prove 100% anything. You can't prove anything in its entirety in medicine because there are so many variables that confound that. So this is intellectually dishonest language. And they say, for example, one study found that aluminum adjuvants in vaccines had the highest statistical correlation with the rise in autism prevalence among numerous suspected environmental causes. Again, correlation does not equal causation. And they say that correlation does not prove causation, but it does merit further study, which we've done. We've done study after study after study after study. And this is, at this point, this is a waste of resources to keep trying to prove something just because you believe it to be true. State of the evidence, infant vaccines, DTaP, Hep B, Hib, IPV, and PCV. The National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986, which, if any of you were in my LionCon talk, which I believe is going to go on, it's going to be released to the line as a separate talk at some point, but the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986 started because of a propaganda documentary talking about, I believe it was the DTaP vaccine, stating that kids were having severe complications from the vaccine and people were in a panic about that documentary. And really what happened with that was there were kids who had seizures, like temporary seizures after receiving the vaccine, which likely could have been febrile seizures, because we know that vaccines can cause an inflammatory response as it stimulates the immune system. That's kind of the intention. So kids can get fevers after getting a vaccine, and febrile seizures in children, especially young children, are very, very common and usually seen as benign. So if you have a child who gets a seizure from having a fever, they're usually not going to have seizures in the future. Like, that is not a seizure disorder. So they didn't accurately communicate what was happening with the vaccines. But this Vaccine Injury Act is in response to that, right? And you can report, like, to this and to VAERS, you can report literally anything as a complication of vaccines. Like, you can, there are stated on VAERS, people have reported murder. People have reported that a murder was caused by a vaccine. People have reported that other car accidents or other injuries have been caused by vaccines. They've claimed a whole slew of things that do not make sense, but they're allowed to report it because of these laws. Right. So just because that there's a law does not mean that the science is in support of that law. Right. Laws are passed by politicians who may or may not be scientists, and most of the time are not. And most of the time are not educated on these issues, but they are trying to appeal to their constituents, right? Like, they are trying to make the right decision for the people that voted for them. So this is policy. This is not data. But it required that the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall complete a review of all relevant medical and scientific information on the nature, circumstances, and extent of the relationship, if any, between vaccines containing pertussis and the following illnesses and conditions, which there's a pretty big list of conditions. So it's interesting that they are fixated on this one thing. They're like, oh, well, we've been instructed by law to investigate specifically DTaP and 11 specific illnesses, including like hemolytic anemia um, and other chronic diseases. Which, why are you not then doing more studies on hemolytic anemia? Why are you only focusing on autism? It seems like there's incentive. There's a political incentive here, or there's a bias going into this of why they care so much more about autism compared to these other conditions that they're still supposedly supposed to be looking into. Since then, multiple reports from the HHS and National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine have examined the links between autism and vaccines. These reviews have consistently concluded that there's still no studies that support the scientific claim that the infant vaccines, DTaP, Hep B, Hib, IPV, PCV, do not cause autism, and hence the CDC was in violation of the DQA when it claimed vaccines do not cause autism. So they're claiming that if you did not prove 100% that there's no link, which again, you cannot prove the 100%, that the CDC can't make statements based on reasonable statistical data, which is absolutely ridiculous. I'm getting so angry the more I read about this. But this is all of their claims. So they go into a 1991 study from the Institute of Medicine, which I tried to look that one up, and it's like there was an error. It's unavailable to read. So we can't even it's unavailable to read without paying like $40 for it. So I did not do that. The Institute of Medicine from 2012. This was a whole. I did look this one up. Let me. Was it that one? Which one was it? Okay, it was this one. So this was the. It says adverse effects of vaccines, evidence and causality, 2012. This is a big paper of literature searching and evaluating data. And it is a lot to get into. And I might cover this one at a separate date because this is just a lot to cover. But we're gonna search autism here and just jump straight to that. All right. Okay, so this is their claim that there isn't enough evidence to accept or reject a causal relationship, which this is problematic again because they are effectively rejecting the null, right? They're trying to say that we should just reject the null if we can't, if we don't have enough data to accept or reject it, which is just does not make sense. Um, okay, so we're gonna read this. This is really small. Here we go. The committee identified two main pathways by which it concludes the evidence is inadequate to accept or reject a causal relationship. The most common pathway to this conclusion starts when the epidemiologic evidence was of limited certainty or insufficient, and the mechanistic evidence was weak or lacking. Another pathway occurs when the epidemiologic evidence is of moderate certainty of no effect, but the mechanistic evidence is intermediate in support of an association. The committee analyzed these sets of apparently contradictory evidence and ultimately decided upon their expert judgment in deciding if a conclusion to favor acceptance was based on the immediate mechanistic data was warranted, or if the conclusion remained as inadequate to accept or reject. So the vast majority of causality conclusions in the report are that evidence was inadequate to accept or reject a causal relationship. Some might interpret that to mean either of the following statements. Because the committee did not find convincing evidence that the vaccine does cause an adverse event, the vaccine is safe. Because the committee did not find convincing evidence that the vaccine does not cause the adverse event, the vaccine is unsafe. Neither of these interpretations is correct. Inadequate to accept or reject means just that, inadequate. If there is evidence in either direction that is suggestive but not sufficiently strong about the causal relationship, it will be reflected in the weight of evidence assessments of the data. However suggestive those assessments might be, in the end, the committee concluded that the evidence was inadequate to accept or reject a causal. So they're saying there wasn't enough information. It's hard to tell from this much that we've read which data they're specifically referencing here. So I'm going to get into this maybe in a different show because this is a lot. But that's one of their statements, one of their sources that they're using. Here, let me go back to this one. Okay, so this one we are going to get more into. Of note, a 2014 HRQ review also addressed the Hep B vaccine and autism. One cross-sectional study met criteria for reliability, and it found a threefold risk of parental report of autism among newborns receiving a Hep B vaccine in the first month of life, compared to those who did not receive the vaccine or did so in the first month. So they found this study that found a threefold risk of parental reports. So people reported autism diagnoses much higher in this particular study after receiving the Hep B vaccine. And again, correlation does not equal causation. I think that's going to be the motto for this particular stream, because they literally just keep repeating that same fallacy over and over and over again. But I did pull up the AHRQ abstract, and this is very, very small. Okay. So safety vaccines used for routine immunization in the United States. So their objective was to conduct a systematic review of the literature on the safety of vaccines recommended for routine immunization of children, adolescents, and adults in the United States as of 2011. We included placebo-controlled clinical trials and cohort studies comparing vaccinated and unvaccinated patients. We also included the following types of post-licensure analyses. You can look into more of that, but a total of 20,478 titles were identified after title, abstract, and full text review. 166 of those studies were accepted for abstraction. The vast majority of the studies either did not investigate or could not identify risk factors for adverse events associated with vaccination. Similarly, the severity of adverse events was inconsistently reported, as was the information that could make the independent severity determination possible. So they were able to use 166 of the studies that met their criteria here. Their conclusion: there is evidence that some vaccines are associated with serious adverse events. However, these events are extremely rare and must be weighed against the protective benefits that vaccines provide. Careful consideration should be given to the investigation of research gaps, including patient risk factors that may be associated with adverse events. However, important factors must be taken into account when determining whether studies are warranted, including severity and frequency of the adverse events being studied, and the challenges of conducting sufficiently powered studies when investigating rare events. So, one thing, okay, so weighing in on this and the kind of the previous thing we looked at. Okay, let's say if there's some evidence that there are some adverse events, here's where the problem comes in then. I'm not necessarily opposed to like doing more studies, right? I think it's okay to keep looking into um this concern. I do think it's a waste of time because we've done enough study on this. But let's say that previous paper was correct and that you can't make a determination whether or not you should reject the null or if you can even make the statement that vaccines do not cause autism. That's not a reason to go into the CDC website and reject the null hypothesis on the website and say that vaccines may cause autism or that vaccines do cause autism. Right. So that's a faulty interpretation of all of this data. But I did pull up this executive summary here, which we will look at. So this is safety of vaccines used for routine immunization in the United States. And they point out some of the concerns that I mentioned before as well. So uh, the AHRQ investigated an evidence report on the safety of vaccines recommended for routine immunization of adults, children, and adolescents as of October 2011. This report, which represents the results of a comprehensive and systematic review of scientific evidence, describes potential associations between vaccines and adverse events, and all that. So, here, what is the evidence that the vaccines included in the 2011 immunization schedule recommended are safe in the short term or long term? So, basically, the questions that have to be answered: what adverse events were reported, right? What adverse events are reported in the studies, like between all those groups? For each adverse event associated with a particular vaccine, what is the severity of that effect? For adverse events without statistically significant associations with a particular vaccine, what is the level of certainty? For each one, what are the risk factors for the adverse event, including age, sex, uh, race, genotype, underlying medical condition, whether a vaccine is administered individually or in combination, schedule of vaccine administration, adjuvants, and medication administered concomitantly. So, again, the burden on the CDC is not to just say, hey, there are reports, there's an increase in autism. They have so much more to demonstrate. What specifically are they pointing like the cause to be? What is the risk associated with that particular adjuvant? Is how much aluminum is needed to cause this result? Are we going to see a dose response relationship, right? Are we going to see uh, more autism with a higher dose of aluminum versus a lower dose? Right? Like, and that's the same issue that we saw with the Tylenol assertion, right? They were trying to say that there's this association between Tylenol and autism, but they couldn't demonstrate that a higher dose of Tylenol had higher likelihood of autism. So that kind of suppresses the likelihood of that. So there are plenty of variables here that they're missing in the CDC statement, and I would like to know more about what specifically they're trying to point at. Are we talking about different age groups? That's something that is also very, very important. Pregnancy, what does that have? Like, does that have any contribution to this? Uh, let's scroll down a little bit here. So most of the adverse events they're pointing at here are Guillain-Barré and MS, uh, encephalitis, fetal loss. Yeah, so there's really not a lot of mention of autism in this, it looks like. Okay, I'm gonna switch over, I think, to so that's the evidence that they are trying to present for why vaccines may cause autism. So let's switch over to Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and we're going to evaluate kind of their arguments. So this is written back in March, but it's still applicable today. In 1971, the FDA approved the MMR vaccine, which combined three vaccines that had been approved previously. The vaccine has proven safe and effective, has been widely administered around the world for decades. Yeah, so they go into when did we start seeing the concerns, and they address the Wakefield study. So the Wakefield paper, I might just summarize that quickly. So there are only 12 children, 12 children. So his sample size was only 12, eight of whom the parents reported developing autism after getting the MMR vaccine. So these children had autism, and they had received the MMR vaccine. The study was described as a consecutive case series, but it wasn't even really that because there was no control group or control period. But even in a case series, can't tell you whether one thing causes another thing. It's simply a description. But once that paper was published, Wakefield got a lot of press and told people that he had shown vaccines had caused autism, which again, that study couldn't even do. The paper was ultimately retracted, and the authors were pulling their name from this paper. So their issues that they identified were that the cases were not consecutive, so they did not include all of the children studied. They cherry picked the cases for ones that fit their narrative. And we know that given the age when children receive the MMR vaccine is also the age when some children regress into autism. So autism is often undiagnosed until a certain period of time because you have to meet certain diagnostic criteria, and a lot of them are social and developmental criteria, right? So we do know that a lot of times kids will reach, age 2 3 years old, and then they will start developing uh the presentation associated with autism and are able to be diagnosed at that point in time. So they cherry picked that time frame when kids start showing these symptoms anyway and said, "Oh, well, the vaccine was given around that time." Well, sure, but it's possible and very likely that those kids would have developed those symptoms anyway, even if that vaccine was not administered at that time. Their next question: do you think it was just Dr. Wakefield himself that made people think vaccines cause autism, or were there other factors? Um, and we kind of addressed this earlier on in the show. It's people wanting to know answers. And so it's fair that people want to know answers about their children. And so you get a lot of panic. And then you have Andrew Wakefield showing up saying, I have an answer to the thing that you're wondering about. And so, of course, he's going to be regarded as an authority figure because he's giving people the answers that they want. What research was done to look into this perceived link? The attention that this question got led to a number of large epidemiological studies that looked into kids who were vaccinated with the MMR vaccine and those who weren't. So there were control groups. So the ones saying that there wasn't a link actually utilized control groups to see, is it the vaccine or is it something else? And those studies found no association between the MMR vaccine and autism because they had children developing autism without having exposure to those vaccines. Once it became clear that the MMR vaccine was not associated with autism, the hypothesis shifted from the MMR vaccine as a cause to thimerosal, which at the time was being used as a preservative in some childhood vaccines. So this takes us back to my discussion at the beginning of constantly moving the goalpost, right? So, like, oh, it's the vaccine that's causing the autism. We evaluate the vaccine and there isn't a link. Okay, well, it's not the vaccine necessarily, that it's the thimerosal in the vaccine that's causing it. Okay, so then we do studies on the thimerosal and then that's shown to not have a link. And so now they're like, uh, saying, "Oh, well, now it's the aluminum, or now it's the fact that they're getting all these vaccines at the same time," which, or like, and we're not even using thimerosal anymore. So, what are you going to point to now? Like, it's just a constant moving of the goalpost because their narrative isn't being met by the data. Thimerosal was never used in the MMR vaccine. So if you're trying to point as thimerosal being the cause of autism, and saying that the MMR vaccine was responsible, then you cannot make that statement because those are contradictory statements. Thimerosal was never used in MMR. Yeah, and so again, they go into number of vaccines given at one time, which again, there was no link. At this point, we have 16 well conducted large population studies. Let's look at these. Oh, and here's another article from them from May. And they have, here, let me share this tab for all of these references. So if you want to look at these, uh and it's funny. Okay, so they actually address this particularly. Remember the big paper that we were reading, what that was cited on the CDC website? That is actually referenced here. The 2012 study is referenced here in this Johns Hopkins explanation. Um, and I want to know what they say about that. Oh, here we go. They actually mention it right here. The overlapping times of childhood vaccine administration and the usual onset of ASD symptoms have led to speculations about a possible causal pathway. However, proposed links have been unsubstantiated. Several theories were proposed to attribute the cause of ASD to vaccines. Wakefield suggested that a dysregulated immune response to measles antigen, so a dysregulated immune response, led to persistent intense intestinal infection, allowing toxins to enter the bloodstream and enter the central nervous system, leading to developmental regression in children. So there's the leaky gut hypothesis, which is debunked. He claims support for this because of his alleged detection of measles virus RNA in bowel specimens of children with ASD. However, his reference study was found to be fraudulent, and no evidence of persistent infection had been shown in studies that used appropriate methods. Another proposed trigger for ASD was thimerosal, an ethyl mercury containing preservative that used to be present in some vaccines, although not the MMR vaccine. Yeah, and so we already addressed that. Yeah, the IOM, the Institute of Medicine, found no valid mechanistic evidence connecting MMR or thimerosal containing vaccines and ASD. So the citation, and that's the citation here, right? The Institute of Medicine, adverse effects of vaccines, evidence and causality from 2012. Remember, that is the one that we looked at. I think I closed out of it. Um, yeah, I think I closed out of that one. But the one that we just looked at, literally, that the CDC is trying to use to say that there is a link, it's clear that they didn't actually read the paper, because Johns Hopkins saying that that same paper found no valid mechanistic evidence connecting these things. So conflicting narrative there. Um, Here, epidemiological evidence. They've had numerous methodologically sound epidemiologic studies exploring an association between ASD and the receipt of MMR vaccine, thimerosal vaccines, and simultaneous vaccination with multiple vaccines, in addition to the relevant systematic reviews and one meta-analysis. Together, these studies included more than 1.8 million children, notwithstanding 11 studies from another pair of authors, all of which had substantial methodological flaws. Uh, the epidemiological evidence consistently shows no association between MMR vaccine, thimerosal vaccines, or simultaneous vaccination and ASD. So we have here the biggest cohort of a study population. Um, Ryan. Yeah, I know. I apologize to everyone that got here later. What had happened was I was going to cover the peptides show this week, but the CDC changed their website this week, so I had to change course. So we're doing this now. So my apologies for that. Um, but yeah, so we have a sample size of 1.8 million, which if we're going to see uh, a causal relationship, we're going to see a lot better statistics because the larger the sample size you have, the more likely your data is going to reflect the bell curve of society, right? Like you're more likely going to capture what the norm is. Um, so compare this 1.8 million with the 12 in the Wakefield study. That's a huge difference in study population. A US cohort study suggested a possible increased risk of ASD among children whose mothers received an influenza vaccination during their first trimester of pregnancy, although this association was not statistically significant after a post hoc analysis adjusting for multiple comparisons, and there was no association between ASD and influenza vaccination received during any trimester. A Swedish cohort study found no association between pandemic H1N1 influenza vaccination during pregnancy and ASD among children, even when restricting vaccination to the first trimester. Another US cohort study showed that receiving Tdap vaccine during pregnancy is not associated with increased risk in ASD in the child. So, again, more reasons to not reject the null hypothesis. Um, yeah, so we kind of covered that in their other tab here. So they're going to get into the rigor in a particular study. So this is very important here. Um, Something we hear from people worried about vaccines is that we need to do a vaccinated slash unvaccinated study, and intuitively that makes a lot of sense. It seems rather straightforward, but in fact, it's more complicated than that. And yes, the way we set up studies for intervention and non-intervention is really complicated in that we have to account for a lot of confounders, and also we have to account for the fact that we don't want to intentionally cause harm, right? So we can't deny people gold standard therapies just because they're part of a study group. Like that is unethical. Consider the example of what causes lung cancer. If you looked at lung cancer rates among people who drink alcohol, you would find that the rate is higher than it is for non-drinkers. And somebody might conclude that drinking alcohol causes lung cancer, but that's not the case. The issue is that people who drink are more likely to smoke, and smoking causes lung cancer. Yeah, so lots of confounding variables, like, and not just what is your specific exposure, what are the other factors leading to um, these higher numbers. But that's not the case. The issue is that people who we already covered that. So drinking could be a confounder. Yep, like I just mentioned. Something associated with the exposure and the outcome, but not part of the causal pathway. Exactly. And in looking at vaccinated versus unvaccinated children, only about 2% of American children are completely unvaccinated. And that 2% is very, very different from the 98%. I received an email last week that said, why can't you just look at Amish children based on the misperception that Amish children are not vaccinated? And we can figure out whether vaccines cause autism and other health outcomes. Yeah, so you can't look at Amish children, and where they're going to explain here, because these study populations are very, very different. Amish children are raised very different. Their lifestyle factors are different. Environmental exposures are different. Their dietary habits are different, and the way that they access and use medicine and healthcare. I've never studied autism among Amish children, but my guess is that even if autism rates were about the same, they are probably much less likely to get diagnosed. And that's absolutely a very important thing within the Amish argument. So, yeah, Amish people do seem to have lower risks, lower rates of autism. However, yeah, they are way less likely to be diagnosed because they're less likely to get evaluated. And if we think about autism being having a very heavy genetic component, when you're in a small insular community, right, those traits are going to be pretty rapidly passed on. And if you are autistic and in a community of other people who are autistic and not diagnosed, it's hard to see a difference in the behavior that would cause them to be diagnosed, right? Like they might be less likely to see the symptoms in their own children because they have the same ones, right? So we have to think about these particular factors and also looking at, are they less likely to be diagnosed as well because of the fact that Amish societal norms and the way they interact with each other are is just very different at baseline, right? The way they talk to people, the way they make eye contact with people, the way they uh, structure their society, the things that we might write off as just a cultural difference may actually be reflective of neurodivergence that is just not being picked up because it's being seen as a cultural difference. So where is the line here? What is the cultural difference, and what is a symptom of neurodivergence? And that's something that would be very, very difficult to tease out. Yeah, and definitely more confounding. So and with that, let's go to the AAP. So I think this will be the last thing that we get into. I have more articles pulled up, but it's yeah, a lot of these organizations we've talked about before. So the AMA, the AOA, the ACP, the AAFP, etc., have all made statements. We're going to, of course, focus on the AAP because it is specifically for pediatrics. Here is their response to this week's events. The AAP says, stop wasting government resources to amplify false claims about vaccines and autism. The CDC has updated its website to include false claims linking vaccines and autism, prompting a swift rebuke from the AAP and other medical experts. We call on the CDC to stop wasting government resources to amplify false claims that sow doubt in one of the best tools we have to keep children healthy and thriving, routine immunizations, said AAP President Susan J. Cressley, MD, fellow of the AAFP. The American Academy of Pediatrics stands with members of the autism community who have asked for support in stopping this rumor from spreading any further. And yeah, we need to show solidarity with the autism community and say that, like, if they don't want to look into this anymore, like, we should stop fucking bothering them about it. Okay, like, we need to be allies. We need to be better allies. And people don't want to have their lives ruined because of all of these stupid myths. Like in a lot of ways, like ABA is essentially conversion therapy for autistic kids, and that is shown to be very problematic and very traumatic for a lot of people who went through that. So uh, we need to do better. And one of the ways in listening to autistic people and their requests, we need to respect that. We need to respect that they do not want this myth perpetuating any further. And luckily, the AAP is doing their part here. The AAP and more than 40 other medical, health, and patient advocacy groups also issued a joint statement condemning the change and called on the CDC to return to its long history of promoting evidence based information. And this is something that we've seen a lot lately with RFK Jr. is that they're literally just claiming that things are evidence based. They're like, oh, well, but we're putting out the evidence based information, but not providing evidence based information, just claiming that what they're saying is evidence based. And that seems to be a trend not only with RFK Jr., but also with the administration in general. Potential links between vaccines and autism have been studied for decades, more than 40 high quality studies in 7 countries. And again, so another thing too, like not just looking at US studies, but looking at global studies, right? If vaccines were related to autism, wouldn't we see evidence of that in other countries? Wouldn't we see global evidence that this is related? And we're not seeing that. So why are autism rates on the rise globally? Well, we're diagnosing people earlier. We're improving our diagnostic criteria where people are more outspoken about their diagnoses. So plenty of reasons. The conclusion is clear and unambiguous. There's no link between vaccines and autism, Dr. Cressley said. Anyone repeating this harmful myth is misinformed or intentionally trying to mislead parents. Science believes there's no single root cause of autism. Interactions between genetic changes and environmental influences likely play a role, according to an AFP fact checked article. Improved awareness, screening, and updated diagnostic criteria have contributed to increases in autism prevalence. At this point, it's not about doing more studies, it's about being willing to accept what the existing studies clearly show. Said Allison Singer, MBA, co founder and president of the Autism Science Foundation. She said spending more money on settled science takes away funding from research on genetics and services for autistic people. False claims further stigmatize autistic people and their families. Despite falsely linking vaccines and autism, the CDC website still contains a header saying vaccines do not cause autism, but an asterisk states that the language has not been removed due to an agreement with Senator Bill Cassidy, MD, who chairs the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Health and Human Services Secretary RFK Jr. made statements with Senator Cassidy during his confirmation hearing. However, Kennedy, a longtime vaccine skeptic, has continued his efforts to erode confidence in vaccines while serving as the nation's highest health official. Remember when RFK Jr. said that people should not be taking medical advice from him? Um, right, right. What happened to that? Um, in the spring, he fired well respected experts on the CDC's vaccine advisory committee and replaced them with people who have spread misinformation about vaccines. In September, Kennedy, Donald J. Trump, and federal health officials made false claims about vaccines, medications, and autism during a White House press conference. Sean T. O'Leary, MD, MPH, FAAP, chair of the AAP Committee on Infectious Diseases, called the latest move to put misinformation on the trusted CDC website madness and a tragic moment for this country. And he said he does not blame the career CDC scientists. For many decades, we could rely on CDC to provide the American public with the best available science, Dr. Leary said. Now our government is using it as an apparatus to spread falsehoods and lies. Yeah, the CDC is now a propaganda machine. The AAP has continuously pushed back on false information and filed a lawsuit against Kennedy over his actions around COVID vaccines and his dismantling of the Vaccines Advisory Committee. Pediatricians have seen firsthand the harm created by the disruptive and politicized decisions to overturn decades of evidence-based federal guidance on immunizations, Dr. Cressley said as the lawsuit was updated earlier this month. These changes have caused fear, decreased vaccine confidence, and barriers for families to access vaccines. And I'm willing to bet that they're going to add this to the lawsuit or file a new lawsuit related to this because people will get hurt. And that's why this matters so much right now is people are going to be hurt by this. And that's really what scares me here. And the fact that politics is being used in this way. And these are children, right? This is being used. Remember how they were all about what about the children with regard to trans topics? Well, clearly they're thinking so much about the children because they would rather children die of measles than be autistic. And this is the same thing that happens with uh this is the same thing that happens with the pro-life arguments, right? They're focusing so hard on this being an issue, but what are you doing for autistic people? What are you doing to give autistic people a better life in this society and reduce stigma? Nothing. They are doing nothing to help. They are just rehashing things that have already been studied to further scare people, further stigmatize autistic people. And it is going to kill children. And with that, that is where we are leaving off today. This has been pretty heavy. And next week, we will get into MLM bullshit, as many of you wanted to see today. Don't forget that later today, we have Holy Spirits is doing a premiere, and Ember is on Holy Spirits today. So definitely go check that out later on. And I can't think of any other big announcements. Oh, I'll leave this last comment from Ember. The goal is to prove we're damaged to justify eugenics, of course. Yep, absolutely. Um, but yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. I hope you can use some of these arguments to push back against misinformation. Like, please go out there, speak out on these topics, correct misinformation where you see it. And if you're not sure, about how to address this, point them to the American Academy of Pediatrics, point them to the AMA, point them to Johns Hopkins, point them to reliable resources so that we can stop this. All right. And I don't think that this is going to end completely. I don't think we're ever going to undo the damage that is being done, but we can help prevent more people from being hurt in the future. Thanks, everybody. I will catch you all in the next one.